So it's really happy to be here. Happy to not be in America right now. so so this is kind of a little break from the hot mess that is happening south of the border. Well, we can talk about that another time. so I'm here to share some of my thoughts, on inclusive excellence and strategies for broadening participation, I think, and improving belonging in STEM disciplines. And so I figured I'd start off by talking about some of the work that I do. I will be going into a lot more detail about my research tomorrow if you're interested. For the non-organic chemistry folks, you can literally close your eyes and space out for the next 2 minutes, or you could try to maybe learn something or understand something. So in my lab, and I work exclusively with undergraduates, by the way. So all my research is done with undergraduate collaborators. And so we're very much interested in making nitrogen heterocycles. So you can see all of these ring systems have nitrogen atoms embedded in their structure. Some of these you're probably familiar with. Most familiar would probably be caffeine. And so we are particularly interested in nitrogen heterocycles because of their abundance in pharmaceutical drugs. If you survey the ones that have been approved by the US FDA, about 60% of all drugs on the market have a ring system in their structure that has a nitrogen atom embedded in it. And so it's a very important area of research to come up with novel and new methods for efficient synthesis of these ring systems so that pharmaceutical companies can improve their syntheses and hopefully drive costs down for consumers. And how we do that or accomplish that is by leveraging a Nobel Prize winning reaction, the copper catalyzed azide alkyne cycloaddition, known colloquially as click chemistry, which affords us this as a product. And then we, by manipulating one of the coupling partners in the azide, can facilitate a spontaneous decomposition of the triazole into a highly reactive intermediate, which we then build back up selectively into different nitrogen heterocyclic systems based on our design of our other coupling partners. And so if you're interested in hearing more about that, I can tell you all about that tomorrow. But I purposely talked about this at the beginning of my talk because if you listen to a scientist give a lecture, specifically an organic chemist, what you just heard on the slide is exactly what you would see. And we are defined by our research. We're defined by the science we do. There is nothing about us that comes through in the science we share. The jargon we use is predefined or predetermined for us. The language, how we explain it, how we make our slides, it's all predetermined, right? And so I'm going to reintroduce myself in the ways that go beyond my science. And I am a chemist, sure. I am a black. I am a cisgendered man. I am queer. I'm an immigrant, first generation. I have advanced degrees, and I have trespasser syndrome. That's not a modified term. I think when people talk about imposter syndrome, there's an assumption that you actually don't belong and you're imposing. But I think trespasser syndrome actually sums up really the case. You're coming in, you are bringing your own talents, but the people around you might not appreciate it. So you feel as if you're trespassing. And so these are kind of the ways I would define myself outside of my general just I'm a chemist, right? And you might have other ways you think about yourself. But if I contrast that to what the typical scientist, at least in America, would look like, it would be quite different in those areas, right? And there are probably only two areas of overlap that I have with who is considered the stereotypical scientist. But yet still I'm expected to carry myself in the exact way. Society has determined that scientists needs to participate in the world in a particular way, and that removes a lot of my identities from the conversation, right? So this brings up, this whole idea of intersectionality, which I wanted to point out is a framework that was this developed and put forward by Kimberly Crenshaw, which really came about initially as Crenshaw described the double discrimination of racism and sexism faced by black women in America. And I really like this framework, right, because it really defines our own unique experiences independent of our science and and our visible identities, right? We all have our unique experiences that come from our own intersectional experiences. And I really like this quote in an interview where she said, it's really just this lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It's not simply that there's a race problem, there's a gender problem, a class, or a LGBTQ problem. Many times that framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of these things, right? And so I would like to say that me sharing my experience with you and my thoughts with you really come from my own experience of my different identities in science. And so let me tell you what led to some of these experiences and how they came to be, a little bit about my background. I grew up in Kingston, Jamaica. You might detect my accent that I've been trying best to hold on to, but the longer I've lived in America, I've lost some of it. And there's Jamaica. I'm sure many of you all know where it is, but if you don't know, it's right there. And I grew up on the southern part of the island in Kingston, and that was little me in grade school. I actually grew up quite poor. My mother was very adamant that we took school seriously. She's like, education was your way out. And so she worked 3 jobs to send me to school and to make sure I got the education I needed. I never saw her. My grandmother was kind of my primary caregiver. But it was an important thing she did for me, right? An important sacrifice, right? To make sure that I got the education I needed. And then I went to a Jesuit Catholic institution. And this was important because it really set me off on the path that I am on today. In Jamaica, a lot of the Catholic schools, specifically Jesuit Catholic institutions, are some of the premier high schools in terms of the quality of education. And so everyone wanted to send their kid to a school like this. My mother was very excited when I got into this high school. And I had these people who then got me interested in science. First, my high school teacher, Shelley Smith, who came out of industry and came back to the classroom and really helped me fall in love with chemistry. And when I was struggling with stoichiometry, it was actually my uncle who made me fall in love with chemistry even further. He had a way of explaining chemistry and making it accessible that a lot of people couldn't. Like, he made connections to religion, to relationships, right? And the religious connection was a stretch, I thought, at first. And then I was like, it makes sense, actually. Jamaica's a very religious country, so it makes sense he would make a connection like that. But I remember we were learning that alcohols were oxidized to carboxylic acids, for those who've taken a chemistry course. And we were like, a lot of things turn into other things. How are we going to remember this? And he's like, okay, think about Christ on the cross. I'm like, what does this have to do with this? He's like, think about it. You know when they said they gave him vinegar? We're like, yeah. We've all heard about that in Bible school. He's like, well, they didn't intentionally give him vinegar. They just gave him some old alcohol in the corner that had just oxidized to acetic acid. He's like, that's how you think about it. It wasn't intentional. They just wanted to give the man a drink. I was like, okay. And so a stretch, but it made sense. And it's actually pretty reasonable argument. And so he was always trying to connect things. And for me, that was very important because in my own career, I looked at that as a way to also help my students think about learning science by looking at their lived experiences, what they're engaging with currently, and to try to make sure I make those connections for them or help them make those connections. I then went on to college at a Jesuit Catholic institution. That's why I went there, because I went to a Jesuit Catholic high school, and my advisors were like, oh, why don't you apply to these colleges? You at least will appreciate, kind of the pedagogy and the philosophy at these institutions and the mission. And so I went to Holy Cross. That's me my freshman year, taking my General Chemistry 1 class. And then when I took organic chemistry, this professor, Professor Jarrett, he made me fall in love with organic chemistry. And once again, he connected it to real world experiences. And he was always showing videos and like, look at this mass spec. That's not actually how it works, and would, a lot of Star Wars connections. And then Kevin Quinn, who made me fall in love with research, right? His passion for research and the way he went about it was just infectious. And so I went on to do my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, where an ugly chemistry building, they all are. They're all falling apart. and I worked with Dr. Winkler, who was fantastic. And I've been fortunate, and I think advisors and educators, if they're in this room, need to realize or remember that you mean a lot to students more than you realize. And I've come to learn that in my own journey with my students, that a kind word, a kind piece of encouragement, even just asking students to remember that you're available and you're present and they can come talk to you, is so much to helping students persist. I remember I came out as a gay man in my third year of graduate school, and because of his generosity over the years, I knew I could just go and say, "Hey, I'm sorry, I'm struggling, but this is what's going on." And he was like very candid, very straightforward. He was like, I've never had to mentor a queer student before, but we just hired a queer faculty member. You should go talk to him." And so I went, and he was like, "Oh, I came out about the same time in graduate school." He's like, "You need to go get therapy. That's very helpful." I'm like, "Okay, all right, I'll go get therapy." So I went to a therapist, and he's like, "You need to see a psychiatrist. You need drugs." And so he's like, "You're not well." And so I went to a psychiatrist, and it was that cascade. And then my PhD advisor was like, "You need to go to San Francisco and just find yourself for a month and work on this collaboration." So it was a series of events that inevitably led me to becoming more comfortable in my own skin and feel as if I was supported. And I have to applaud my institution at the time, because they hired a queer person, and diversity and representation matters. If I didn't talk to this person, I'm not sure if I would have gotten the advice I needed that only he could have given, because he had his own experience as a queer person in graduate school. And so from then on, after visiting San Francisco, the Bay Area, I fell in love with it. I also met Professor Richmond Sarpong, who was a black chemist. This was the first time I met a influential black person in chemistry. And I never saw myself as going to graduate school or even doing a PhD and doing anything with that, and to work for someone who was like the physical manifestation of, a black immigrant person who's been very successful, was so encouraging and exciting for me. And so another ugly chemistry building at Berkeley, and Professor Sarpong, who's honestly been a fantastic mentor, even over since I left Berkeley. Every paper I've written, I've sent him. I'm like, "What do you think, Richmond?" And he's been so supportive and so very helpful. And, went back to Holy Cross once I saw that they were hiring. I was like, I want to go back. But that's my academic journey. And I think as scientists, we need to realize that there's more to us than our science, that we bring to bear to our science. And I think we often forget that our outside interests inform our science productivity and creativity. And so I'm just going to share some of mine with yours. I love music. You can catch me in a karaoke bar somewhere. I love to dance. And so when TikTok came about during the pandemic, which I didn't have, but that's when I joined, because everyone was just sending me videos and I had to download the app to watch them. And then I went down the rabbit hole myself and realized that I'm obsessed with Gen Z because they actually dance, right? And for me, growing up in Jamaica, that's just normal. That's what you do. Everyone in the island knew how to do a particular dance. It didn't matter where you lived. Some DJ would create a new dance, and everybody, no matter where you live, would learn that dance within a week. You go to an event and everyone knew the dance. So for the first time living in America, I kind of saw that as well. And that was through social media. I'm like, everyone's learning the renegade or I'm like, this is such a great community. I'm so excited to be a part of this. And so I was very happy to learn dance moves and get to, keep dancing. And then I love tennis. I love plane spotting, like to go identify planes on the runway or pull up my app. I'm like, "Ooh, that's a Boeing 787. I still play Pokemon Go. Do not judge me. And so I bring this up because I think STEM creativity exists at the intersection of your culture, your education, and your interests. And we bring those all to bear, whether we realize it or not, in what we do. And we should encourage people to bring more of it to the work that they do. I think it's important for us to invite people to not leave aspects of their identity at the door of the lab before they enter it. We need all of it if we're going to advance science. And so I tell my students, bring your creativity, bring your interests. We'll find a way to make it advance science. And you'll be happier being in the space if you can bring your full self to work. So, I've been working with a lot of students over the years, trying my best to take what I've learned over the years, the things that have benefited me and have helped me, and to tie that to their academic journey and help them find their own voice and ways in which they could thrive in science. But this lecture isn't about me. That's my journey. It really is about my thoughts about how we can broaden participation in the current generation and beyond. Science is under attack. I think science literacy, particularly in the United States, is at its lowest. I think we have to work harder at making people see that science is a viable path and it's a critical endeavor, and to excite people about it and to educate people more about it. However, I think, a lot of the media coverage, I would say, on this generation, Gen Z, is not very positive. A lot of my colleagues or educators don't think very highly of this generation. If you just read some of the newspaper clippings, they're all negative. Gen Zers make difficult employees. Gen Z branded the hardest generation to work with. They lack discipline. They are lazy, self-absorbed, screen obsessed, whiny, privileged, right, etc. It's just all negative, right, for the most part. And I just think that this generation is misunderstood, or people just haven't done enough work to recognize that technology has changed how they go about in this world. And for those who are not accustomed to a world that's driven by technology, then of course you're going to feel left out and you're going to think something's wrong. And so I think if we want to be better educators, we have to understand this generation, but look back at our own challenges as well. As a millennial, the prevailing thought of millennials wasn't that positive either. If you just go back to the Time magazine in 2013, you can see the exact words we just read on the screen for Gen Z. Millennials are lazy, entitled narcissists who still live with their parents, right? And so those are the identical. That's the identical language used for millennials. But somehow we forget that we were thought of as a problematic generation. And for the Gen Xers in the room, it's very similar, right? They weren't so aggressive with the language, but laid back, late blooming, or just lost, right? And so what really this is, it's some fantastic work I'll talk about in a second, but it's really this idea that all generations are lazy, right? And I love this compilation by Paul Freire at UCalgary, actually, who compiled this list of newspaper clippings throughout time that really showed that, this criticism that nobody wants to work anymore is really just capitalists complaining for starvation wages. And you can go, back to 1969, and you can see that, people have been complaining that nobody wants to work anymore, right? I think of that Kim Kardashian meme when she's like, nobody wants to work anymore. You can actually go all the way back to 1894, he showed, right? Apparently nobody ever wanted to work, right? So this is a criticism also, right? It's generational. It's throughout history, and I think it's just that people don't understand how each younger generation, their needs, and how to excite them and get them to be interested or to do work in a way that's productive. So it's a psychological bias. I like this paper that Prasker and Schooler wrote, like really arguing that this really is just a psychological bias. Like, we all know society has not been on some decline. I mean, look at what we've uncovered scientifically in the past 100 years, right? It doesn't seem like we are declining scientifically, right? We are literally discovering more and more things every day, and the technology is advancing rapidly. But it's a psychological or mental trick, right? We think back to our youth fondly. Successful people remember the times they're in the library studying. They don't remember the friends they had who were literally wasting time, right? Or not being as productive, right? So successful people remember their youth fondly, and so it's really this psychological bias. So what did I learn about this generation? I learned a lot after doing a deep dive in 2020 on social media, starting then. Of course, Gen Z, born 97 through 2013. We're coming up on Gen Alpha soon in colleges, but they're digital natives, right? I remember a period of my life when I did not have a cell phone. But I don't think young folks nowadays, born 97, can remember life without technology. As a matter of fact, I tell my colleagues that it's their fault. Like, I've been in a lot of faculty assembly meetings where my colleagues have given their kids their iPads to shut them up so, they cannot talk and they can, participate in a meeting and have their kid next to them. It's like, you kind of gave the kid the technology, right? And so, definitely as a result, shorter attention spans due to how online content is delivered in short bursts. And I think these are important things to know about the generation you're teaching because that informs how we educate as well, right? You can't give one midterm and a final anymore. You have to give exams, more exams as the semester progresses to really think about how students are retaining information. And of course, as I mentioned, technology is not a tool, it's a part of life, it's an extension of who they are. And as a result, we have to leverage that when it comes to academic learning. But other things I learned, they're accustomed to instant access to information, right? They can get everything on movies, Netflix, music, Spotify, shopping, Amazon. Not anymore. We don't shop there. Academic learning. You can go to YouTube, Chegg, Khan Academy, right? So everything is instantly available. They're we economists, age of sharing, right? Ubers, Airbnbs. And as someone who's queer, I mentioned to you all that I think of this work through the lens of my own identities, and if you look at the data, a higher percentage identify as queer, right, than previous generations, not because they aren't, but because we've advanced as a society, and many of us currently are more accepting of who we are and are able to live more freely and openly, right? And the biggest thing I learned was that they are deeply concerned about their future. And this is an important one that I think informs the way I go about educating. When I was younger, and many of us in this room, the promise of a career was there. If you did certain things, you would be guaranteed to have a career. If you went to high school, you got your degree in college, you got a PhD, you will get a job. You'll be able to buy that lovely house. You'll be able to buy that nice car. Unfortunately, that's not the case today, right? And so for a lot of students, there's a lot of anxiety about the future, about the world they're inheriting. And so for many of us as educators, we have to rethink the goal of the courses we teach and the material we provide to students. So the goal can no longer be what comes at the end. The goal has to be the journey. And so we have to make our classrooms and our academic spaces the joy, the goal. And that's what I think is very important to think about, and one way we can help to address some of the anxiety a lot of students face. And you think about some of the stuff, and this is particular to the US, right? School shootings are things I didn't have to think about. That's having to do with school shooting drills, racial reckoning in the US, where, after the murders of Trayvon Martin and folks like that, where a lot of African American black students don't feel as if they belong in these spaces. I mean, you think about the COVID-19 pandemic that upended our teaching, and we have to transition to online learning, and not everyone's adept at doing that. And to learn chemistry online, especially organic chemistry with three-dimensional aspects to it, it's quite challenging, right? So also anti-abortion laws. I know in the US those are increasing significantly, and as we observe a significant increase in women getting degrees in the sciences, right? They're coming into our classrooms feeling as if they don't have autonomy over their bodies. That's an additional thing to think about. For queer folks who are not openly queer, there are significant numbers of anti-LGBTQ plus laws in the US, particularly attacking trans folks, and the list goes on. Climate change, right? What kind of world are students inheriting? So these are really crazy things to go through your education in your life thinking about, and it does have an impact on how you learn. And so because of that, I think STEM education is at a crossroads. I think we have to reimagine how we mentor and how we educate. I think we have to incorporate cultural and social issues in our curriculum, in our classrooms, as we see that our classrooms are becoming more and more diverse. We have to sensitize ourselves to the challenges that the younger generation faces, that they face. And something we've not been very good at is we haven't been able to increase retention or participation of those with minoritized identities. We have to rethink how we do that, right? And it's not like people haven't been thinking about that. People have been thinking about that. But the way that we've been going about it in education has been problematic. And there's a lot of literature that's been published on the approach that I would say folks have been working on. And that's really this idea of deficit thinking, right? Where students are flawed. Something is wrong with them and they need to be fixed. Instead of looking or examining the factors that lead to student success, we examine the factors that lead to student failure. And because of that, we kind of focus on students as weak instead of looking at their strengths. And David Asai wrote a beautiful paper in Cell that articulates that deficit thinking, and the way we've been doing that with remedial courses, and instead of like uplifting students, we've actually been been pushing them down, right? It has not closed the racial and ethnicity gap in science. If you look at these charts, which shows participation of people who are excluded on the basis of their ethnicity and race versus those who are not, you can see that nothing's changed in terms of participation since 2017, since 1992 and 2017. And so the whole thing is we have to change how we go about educating. And what David Asai argues is we have to work on the belonging piece, right? When students feel like they belong and that the system, the institutional systems, actually work to uplift them, then we can see them being successful. It's very challenging, right? Because what happens is that this deficit thinking is embedded in the way our institutions work, right? It's systemic, as a matter of fact. And it only serves, it's pervasive, it seeps into the culture, our practices, and it's pervasive, and it really only serves to reduce retention instead of improving it. And so a lot of folks have talked about this, and the question is, how can we envision inclusion? And a colleague of mine who I really admire, does some fantastic work in this area, wrote this beautiful piece that talks about the fact that we have to move beyond content and start thinking about mindset and social context. And that's what's going to really help with the belonging piece. And when you talk about that to a lot of colleagues, it's like, let's not be obsessed with teaching every single reaction or everything in your course, right? We can cut 5% of the content and focus on mindset and focus on social context and in culture and inclusion, because that's what's going to help students go through. But when you mention that a lot of people have these criticisms, they're like, what about the rigor? We're dropping our rigor, right? We're lowering our standards. We're not lowering standards. As a matter of fact, we're making it more accessible by cutting out 5% and focusing on the connections that students can make to the material. The other criticism you hear is that, well, the current model works for a lot of students. What will happen to them? They'll be fine. We're trying to bring up the other students as well. And also the current students need to see how everything connects if they're going to go out into a world that is more diverse. And so I think this is the question we have to ask, and what I really think is important is that how far can an inclusive mindset take us, and cultural responsiveness? And I think this is what we need to work on. And there's data to back this up. Harper and co-workers did an extensive study of HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, and found that they have such high persistence in STEM. If you look at this data from the NSF survey, 31% of black students with PhDs came from HBCUs. That's a significant number with respect to the percentage of HBCUs in the US. And so what he did was he did an extensive study and saw that these schools they were more likely to have an achievement model in the way they teach and less so of this deficit model. And the same thing goes for HSIs, historically Spanish institutions. And so I think if we can adapt some of these culturally relevant pedagogies, we can see improvement of increase in participation of diverse folks. And the other thing is, diversity is an asset. The question is, why are we doing that? It's because it's an asset. And it's really crazy to me sometimes when I have to tell people that we need more people participating in science, right? We need more people. Why? I mean, for a lot of reasons. It leads to diverse investigations and solutions, right? I love to quote this paper, the Journal of Labor Economics from 2015, that did an extensive study of 2.5 million science articles and found that the ones that were most cited had the most diverse co-authorships compared to the ones that were ethnically homogenous. And I think that speaks to the fact that when you have different voices at the table, you can ask different questions to pursue, and you can also come up with novel solutions to the questions that with limited eyes you might not find the answer to immediately. But beyond that, it's really the accomplishments of people who are diverse that have contributed. I think about the fact that we can be able to address health disparities. Gaps in technologies are challenges that still exist. You think about maternal morbidity and mortality rates, right? You think about facial recognition software that disproportionately misidentifies black women, right? These are questions that people are like, hey, we need to work on this. And also just highlighting the contributions of these folks. Like, if it wasn't for Gladys West, we wouldn't have the GPS. If it wasn't for Alice Ball, right, we wouldn't have had our first partial cure to leprosy in the early 1900s, right? And it's really weird to think about it that the country of Pakistan celebrated her work by giving Hawaii a tree in her honor, which she isolated the compound from. But you never learn about that, right? In the US, at least. And people like Elijah McCoy, who you all should be very familiar with, who was impactful with all the patents he created that revolutionized the railroads and the steam trains. And it's believed that that's where the term the real McCoy came from. It was from actually Elijah McCoy. And so these are influential people who, if it weren't for the HBUs that some of them went to or the educational opportunities they had, they would not have been able to contribute to our own lived experiences in ways that we don't even realize. Like, I mean, I'll point out Percy Julian as one of my favorite examples, who, as an organic chemist, didn't get to do his PhD at Harvard because they couldn't fund him. To be funded at Harvard, you had to get a TA-ship, and their TA-ship required you to teach students, and nobody wanted a black man teaching white kids in 1930s, and so he had to go to Europe, right? So thank goodness for the University of Vienna for accepting him, or else he wouldn't have gone on to synthesize steroids that were so impactful in the 1950s. And so this is why it's important. But as a queer person, I want to point out that there's a preponderance of social science literature that exists that has studied how to address some of these challenges around race and gender, but there really is nothing about queer folks, and there's some systemic barriers as a result to understanding how the rising number of queer people are going to persist in STEM, and what are some of the challenges that they face, right? And there's a lack of SOGI data, right? There's no sexual orientation or gender identity data that's collected, at least in the US, by our federal agencies. And I think that that's problematic, right? There's been a lot of pushback by professors and other folks that we need to do this. And I love John Freeman out of Columbia, who's written extensively about this challenge and articulates that we cannot reduce disparities if we don't measure them, right? As scientists, this is something that should be foundational to the work that we do. And as a queer person myself, I think if we're not doing that, it really is just erasure, right? It's queer erasure. It is really a symptom of what is the traditional ways in which we exclude folks, right? And the normative exclusion that exists across disciplines, but in STEM. And so for those who aren't familiar with normative exclusion, I have a definition of it here. It's really just the dismissal of knowers based on unwritten norms, right? And so I think people are like, well, we don't need that data. There are not that many queer folks. Why do we measure this? But it's important, right, to measure and to know. And so I have taken to social media to kind of help to address some of these, or to build representation, visibility, and kind of resilience in students. But I want to point out ways in which normative exclusion and how I use social media to push back against that. So normative exclusion in STEM manifests itself in these norms of impersonality, and I'm sure we're all familiar with this. This is how we're expected as scientists to show up in scientific spaces. We're expected to be impersonal, objective, data-driven, emotionless, apolitical, and non-ideological, right? And I'm definitely not many of those things. Emotionless, definitely not. Impersonal, definitely not. And how we show up, right? Physically, how we show up, right? For example, I love Kem Phil. I'm going to show a video. I like Kem Phil a lot. He's fantastic. But how he shows up is kind of the traditional way in which you would see a scientist, right? And nothing's wrong with that. But this is kind of how we're expected. And if we deviate from this, then we're not welcome to the table. Oops, I'm not sure how I can play this. I need to hit the play button. Oh. Oops, where's the sound now? We had it earlier. Anyway, it's quick, but the point is, you can see, he's wearing a white lab coat, he's a straight white man, he had on his wedding ring, and he is standing there like, yup, that's a scientist. And then you see me. And you're like, who is this guy? With my multiple lab coats, etc. So I like to make these videos to challenge the norms. Right? So that's me with my 5 million different lab coats. Depending on the day of the week, I have a lab coat that I can use, right? Depending on my mood. So really what I like to do is to use social media to challenge the picture of a scientist, redefine who shows up and how we show up in scientific spaces, and use contemporary cultural touch points to kind of stretch these normative expectations in STEM, right? So I'm redefining who shows up. And for me, visibility is the way I do that. It's a critical tool. And so I have this other video I want to show you. So that's a video my lab and I made. So my students in my research lab are very, they're young folks. They're in their late teens and early 20s. And so every year as a group, we make a video based on whatever they want. So that year was 2022, and apparently Bridgerton season 3 was coming out. And so Matt in the back left, back right for you, or left, yeah, for you, he was like, we should do Bridgerton, and I was like, let's do it. As long as I get to be the diamond of the season, we are very much, let's do it. And so every year we make this video. But what was really fantastic is we posted this video, and so many people were like, oh my God, these scientists are cool. Scientists actually like can dress up. I'm like, yeah, that's what's wrong with that. And it was fascinating to see the response of like, wow, scientists are humans. They can have fun. They can have emotions. They can dress up, and they can be a normal person. So I think changing the perspectives of who a scientist is and how we exist in the world is very important to inviting others in. Okay, so how do you do that though in a classroom, right? Because while that's my public facing work of challenging how people see scientists, who's a scientist, how we dress, I wear a rainbow lab coat, how do we do that in our classrooms? Many of us are educators or aspiring educators. And I think in order to accomplish that and to broaden participation and increase diversity, we really have to think about these multiple interacting components of inclusive pedagogy that I think are about teaching techniques, instructor mindset, and classroom culture. So if you think about a Venn diagram, right, with those three interacting components, I think if we hit these three things, then we can see the persistence of people across the spectrum, right, in STEM. So teaching techniques, of course, I'll spend the rest of my time talking about that. But there are a lot we can do. And so I'm sharing my ideas around that. And my ideas are going to be focused on queer folks because I think that's the group of folks that there's just not a lot about. So active learning, we all do that to some extent, but I think that's very critical. If you think about how this younger generation learns, that's going to work really well. As I mentioned before, multiple forms of engagement and assessment, right? Multiple exams, quizzes, different types of assessments are going to definitely be something that will be more effective. But the representation piece is still critical. And when I say it's still critical, I mean it's not good enough to just throw some people up on a slide and be like, oh yeah, here's this person who contributed, let's move on, right? I think we have to talk about their struggles. A lot of students I've come across now have struggles with resilience, and it's understandable, right? A lot of them are like, why am I working so hard with this stuff? I'm never going to get a job. I see other people in the field who are complaining they don't have jobs, or they go on to do something totally different. People with degrees who can't get jobs in their field. So as I mentioned, we have to help them build resilience, particularly those with diverse identities. And so when we talk about science, we should highlight those people. But it's not good enough to highlight them, right? Like Alan Turing, Lynn Conway, etc. It's important to talk about their journeys and their struggles so the students can see that struggles are a part of the journey and that they will be fine. I like to think about Lynn Conway, right, who kind of developed the microelectronic chip that kind of revolutionized CPU processing, who was fired from IBM when she came out as a trans woman, and now they hail her work, right? I think about, as I mentioned, Alice Ball, who came up with that partial cure for leprosy, Alma Hayden, and I teach about some of these folks. Like the bottom two are perfect people to talk about in my course and to integrate within the work that we do. Alma Hayden was the head of the FDA spectrophotometry division in the 1950s, a black woman at the head of that division in the 1950s. And not only was she doing all of that work, but she did beyond that. She did even more consequential work where she had an intern of hers surveyed spectra, IR spectra, to show that a drug that was being sold to be a cancer drug called carbimazine was just creatine, and went to testify in Congress, and those folks were charged. And so this was important work that was critical to human health. And people don't talk about that work. And it's a perfect place to talk about infrared spectroscopy. Like, here is the article, here is the story, read about it. They actually have the spectrum. You can see her comparing, and to see her standing with four white men beside her and she's leading the team. I think a lot of students see that as a powerful contribution on her part and become more resilient as a result. But it's not, we can't stop there. I think we have to incorporate, as I mentioned, in social issues and culture into our curriculum. I think it needs to be embedded, and it needs to be done in a way that everyone sees themselves in science, right? So I'm not advocating that we teach a queer chem course, right? Where it's like all queer. I'm giving you examples of how you can integrate one community, and I think we all need to see ourselves, right, in it. And so another way we can do it is through problem sets, right? We all write problem sets. This is a very low level change that we can do. How many people have seen this question if you've taken a chemistry class or a physics class, right? We've all done this question, and I taught general chemistry, I should say, for the first time in the fall of 2022, hopefully the last time. I'm an organic chemist. It was fun, but I wouldn't be mad if I didn't teach it again. But I was teaching Gen Chem, and I'm like, why is every single reference or question in the back of the chapters about throwing a baseball? I'm like, is there anything else? And then I thought about it, and I was like, the 1940s was kind of the heyday of baseball in America, and that's when these textbooks were first written. So the questions just they stayed, right? So I'm like, that's an example of where we haven't evolved in terms of what are the current generation, what would they relate to? What are they throwing these days, right? It doesn't have to be a baseball. It could be a chancla. It could be whatever, right? Whatever you want to throw, you can throw a spear, right? Just change it. Same script, different cast. And so I was like, okay, how could I make this accessible to queer students? I'm like, oh, they all watch RuPaul's Drag Race. You can imagine changing the problem like this. Just giving them this video. So if you didn't see that because it was so quick, Money Exchange took off a pussycat wig and she threw it, but there was another one underneath. So it's kind of like, what happened? Was funny. So that's it. Just change the question. What's the wavelength of the wig Money Exchange snatched at 30 meters per second, right? It's not that hard, right? It's like literally same script, different cat. And you could see this, you could do that with anything. All you have to do is like, who's in my class? What are the kids listening to this? What are they doing? Like, have conversations with them. Like, what TV programs are you watching? How can I integrate this with the material? We don't have to always be like John and Sue are walking down the street, right? We could change the names up, right? It's, I think, a very low bar for us to work on being inclusive culturally, right? And a lot of times I tell my colleagues, they're like, there is no culture in STEM. I'm like, yes, there is. This is baseball. Baseball is culture, right? That is culture, and it's there in our textbooks. So the other thing you could imagine is making analogies, right? Content analogies. You could make analogies to people's lived experiences. For example, I go on my soapbox when I talk about cis-trans isomerism, right? This is a very straightforward, well-known principle in chemistry. It's how we identify molecules. They can be a cis or a trans molecule based on the orientation of the groups across that double bond, right? And so we use that all the time. And so that's in my classroom when I talk about gender identity, right? And of course, all my queer students are like, yeah, this concept makes sense, cis and trans. I am a cis man. I identify with the gender as assigned at birth, so my hydrogens are on the same side, right, of the double bond. So it's a very straightforward concept. And of course, I like to point out to my students, I'm actually going to skip this video. I made a video about it. But I like to point out to my students that the trans version of the molecule is more stable, right? And that's a fact as well. So to my trans students, I'm like, you're very stable. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, okay? And so other things we can do to infuse culture is also to affirm people's identities, right? For example, to stick with the queer theme here, about a quarter of queer folks use gender-neutral pronouns. And, I've heard from students that my faculty member or my supervisor will not use my preferred pronoun. And I think in science, that's kind of hypocritical as scientists. And the reason why I think it's hypocritical as scientists is because we will jump through hoops to tell students that light is both a wave and a particle, right? So light's got quite two pronouns there, right? It's a wavicle, right? So because of that, if you can like, and that's a complex concept for students, but we will do everything we can for them to understand. So if you can do that, you can say he, they, or they, them, right? It's not that hard. And so I think light is the OG non-binary entity in the universe. Um, okay, so back to the fact that this generation learns differently, right? We have to, as educators, if we want to broaden participation, really think about the ways that our generational differences do we have to adapt to them. So for example, we got to infuse virtual reality, video lectures, potentially apps, webcasts, podcasts, websites, social media, all of that. I mean, you don't have to do all of them, but start thinking about how we can utilize these tools, technology for helping students learn. And so I want to point out an observation here that show that it has more than just generational benefits, but it has benefits when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. This was a fantastic tool that came out of North Carolina State by Maria Gallardo Williams, and the intention was to provide access to pregnant women who couldn't take an in-person lab. Around 2018, 29, this was conceived. Unfortunately, wasn't funded through many funding agencies because they thought there weren't enough pregnant women to justify the cost of developing these labs. However, by taking it to the military, they're like, yes, we have military folks who are abroad, are on their missions, and so this would be great for them to have access to, and it was funded. And then enter the pandemic. A year later, this became the only way for all students to access the labs, and it became utilized across the globe. A lot of institutions use this. But what came out of this was not just the fact that it was a fantastic way for students to get their lab experience without an in-person lab, but it showed that we have a long way to go towards inclusion, particularly for those with minoritized identities. The assessment piece, and one interesting observation they found in the assessment was a lot of the black students said they preferred the virtual lab over the in-person lab. And that's initially kind of crazy to say, right? Why would you not want to touch the flask yourself? Why would you not want to interact with that? And I think we discount the value of human relationships and the positive environments that we exist in, because if you read further into the assessments, the students say, my virtual reality lab TA talks to me, but my in-person one does not. And so we forget that the classroom ecology and the culture within our classrooms can serve to alienate. And we all have a role to play in making sure that we create communities and environments that make sure that everyone feels that they belong. And that's not just on the educators, that's on the TAs, that's on us as classmates and peers to support and invite each other in. So that's one positive outcome. But digital media in general, I think, serves to help students to cope if those spaces aren't positive for them. It allows them to remove themselves from those environments that might alienate them, and so they can educate themselves. And so I think it's important to leverage these virtual tools, not just for generational differences, but it can also help a student to thrive if the space that they're learning in isn't welcoming. And so in my class, I provide them with a ton of resources that are external. Websites. I love RS chemistry, and I have to give a lot of credit to Neil Garg. He is an organic chemist at UCLA. Has a whole chemical education wing of his research, and he's developed a lot of websites and programs as a result that are focused on specialized skills in organic chemistry, particularly that students can develop. So RS Chemistry is a beautiful one. It's a website. You can go on that one if you're familiar with it, and you can figure out R and S configuration, and you're timed, and you can do medium, high, expert level, easy, medium, expert, and you can do it really quickly. I like Chairs. That one is really nice. It's like, how do you flip your chair configurations, and do you know where the substituent is going to fall on the other chair, and you have to do it really, really quickly. And so these are ways that students engage in the world, right? They're on their phones. They're ordering things on their phone. They're ordering food every day, Grubhub. They know how to navigate their phones. So why don't we integrate that with learning, right? So that's something. And also Instagram pages. I follow this one, a number of Instagram pages I follow that I wake up in the morning and I'm like, okay, what's this NMR? Oh, I think it's this molecule, right? So I'm engaging engaged in learning. My new favorite one, by the way, for organic chemists is Chemdal, Chemdal.com. This one is organic chemistry Wordle. And what it does is, if you go on your phone right now, you can find it's Chemdal, Chemdle.com. You get 6 tries, like Wordle, and it color codes the molecule so you can know if you're on the right track with each guess. And it also ranks you, as a matter of fact. So it's a really fun way to do reactions and try to come up with a product. And it's a way that we exist, or this generation exists in the world. And so the last 2 things, I'm not going to go in detail about these, but really, the teaching techniques are important, but as I was alluding to with the classroom culture, is that it really is an interactive Venn diagram, intersecting Venn diagram. Without the instructor mindset, it doesn't mean anything, right? We need instructors who are going to approach their work with a growth mindset and do it authentically, right? I think students crave authenticity. They crave an educator who is real with them, who can reveal much of themselves. I'm not saying tell them your personal life, but share your stories of your own struggles. Share your stories of your journey. Invite them in, right? Make this a space where it's a collaborative effort or endeavor for learning. And of course, the classroom culture piece, which is we have to work on that sense of belonging. Whatever you can do to make sure that your classrooms and your spaces are welcoming to everyone. One thing I've stopped doing, and I really love this thing that I've stopped doing, is to give extra credit for doing more chemistry. What I find is I've given them already like hundreds of problems to do. Like doing 2 more for another point, right, is great, but I want to incentivize community building. So I give them extra credit if they actually show up to games and events of people in their classroom. And you have to take a picture with them, the person, and send it to me via email. And that's really helped them to foster connections across difference. That has really helped them with their learning. And so, you know, my last 2 slides, this does work. We've done some summer studies with students who are with minoritized identities, and they've pointed out that, you know, their goals are they want to be seen as multidimensional individuals who have assets and potential. That goes along with the belonging piece, of course. They want to be encouraged and reassured through the learning process. And they want to be included in a supportive community of learners. And I think if we really focus on the belonging piece, we can accomplish inclusive excellence, right? When we can celebrate as a community and express the joys of achievement together. And so with that, I want to, I have one more slide. Sorry, I forgot about this slide. I added this. We also need to do this work at the faculty level, right? It's not just working with students, but we need diversity also in our faculty. And there are a number of ways we can accomplish that. I have some here. Our hiring practices have to change. We have to broaden all the outlets that we advertise in and the institutions we typically lean on to produce PhDs that we go after. We have to retrain faculty on how to best educate students in our classrooms, especially more diverse populations. Cluster hires are important for retention of faculty, having people who you can identify with and talk to and share stories, or efforts and our advances at my institution around queer issues only came about because our institution hired 4 queer folks in my year, unintentionally, because each department does their own hire. It just turned out that 4 of us were queer. And as a result, with the cluster of us that were queer, we were able to really transform the institution and practices, right? We even help institute gender-neutral bathrooms, LGBTQ plus mentoring for students, invite speakers in that can give a perspective that can help faculty in their work. Mentorship, as I mentioned, and also investing in future faculty, right? So we now have a program at my institution where we have this Future Faculty Institute, right, where we're bringing in folks who want to become professors with minoritized identities, and they get to spend a year teaching a course or so, but also be mentored by others. So when they go on their own journeys of seeking jobs, they already have that experience from our institution. And then finally, I'm pretty sure this is a video I made to showcase diverse faculty in STEM, right? And these are people that are part of my external community beyond my institution that I have built community with, and we share ideas as faculty who work at primarily undergraduate institutions. How do you navigate these spaces? And so we did like a Family Matters for those who've ever seen that TV show. Maybe not for the Gen Zers, you probably don't know that. But the sound might be familiar. I had to be by the mirror. Sorry. So that was a cute video just showcasing diverse chemists that people might not know exist. And just, I really enjoyed this community and spending time with them. And so with that, I'm pretty sure this is my last slide. It is. Thank you all for having me. I want to acknowledge all the students who have worked in my lab over the years. And also funding sources for the research that I do. Those are the current people in my lab right now. And also to you all for inviting me and having me here. I hope what I shared was helpful in some way. And thank you so much.